You may recall that when we met last time, we talked about FDR and his fireside chats and how that was used as a tool in American history to have conversation with the citizens and people of our country. And so we're using that image to talk just a little bit about vision and who we are and where we're going and trying to discern together what God has going on amongst us. And so today I actually have a quote from one of his relatives that I want to read. Theodore Roosevelt, of course related to him and a president before him, said these words, and these words may be familiar to some of you. A very famous person today, author named Brené Brown, uses this text quite often, and so it may be familiar to some of you if you've read her work. But I want to read it to you. It's called "The Man in the Arena," and it's a profound word, I think. Teddy Roosevelt says this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds." Hey, I need that. Or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in worthy cause? Who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." That's an interesting quote, I think. I imagine for some, that strikes as a football coach who's talking to the team, getting them excited for the game. And for others still, it may sound just a little bit like something that gives anxiety. The idea that maybe being a critic is not the best way to live life, but the best way to live life is to risk, to take a chance, to put it all in the line and see if defeat or victory is coming. Today we're going to read a story about great risk in the book of Judges. I talked to you about a judge not too long ago. We talked about Samson, and I put this picture up before and talked about the cycle of judges. And just before we read the story of the judge today, I want to remind you of the historical situation that we find ourselves in. We're going to talk about Deborah in chapter 4 and 5 of Judges. She's the third judge after Ehud here, and you'll see that the full cycle of the judges is written here. But the cycle of the judges is that Israel rebels against God, God becomes angry, Israel is oppressed by a foreign nation, Israel repents, God raises up a judge and delivers Israel, there is peace, the judge dies, and then Israel rebels against God once more. And with each of the judges in that book, this cycle happens in perfect rhythm. And so Deborah is risen up as a judge after Ehud has died. We're told that in the first verse of chapter 4. And Israel has once again done evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they are now being oppressed by Jabin, the king of Canaan. And this oppression happened some 20 years. And God raises up a prophetess, which seems like a pretty important designation, a prophetess, a woman, to be in charge of the people. She is the judge of Israel. She is the most powerful person in all of God's people. She oversees debates and disputes. She has a place under what's called Deborah's tree, and she sits there and she rules amongst the people. This story takes a definite feminine turn, to say the least, because Deborah comes to recognize the problem under which Israel is under, and she wants to go and address Jabin, the king of the Canaanites. She wants to, as is part of the cycle of the judges, to address this foreign nation that is oppressing them. And so she calls in her general and sits him down and has a conversation with him and says, we need 10,000 men to take care of Jabin. Now, Jabin had 900 iron chariots. That is the finest in war material that there was the day, iron chariots. And he had many more of them and was cruel and was willing to fight. And when he fought, he won. And Deborah thinks, as she calls in Barak, her general, that they need, about 10,000 men to go and address the Canaanites. Barak's response is interesting. He says, if you go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. That's not exactly confidence inspiring in your general. Not, yes, ma'am, Deborah, we will do this. I believe in you. Not, with God's help, we can do this. It's, hey, listen, if you go into battle, I'll follow you. But if you're not going, I ain't going either. You'd kind of hope your general would have a little bit more courage than that, right? But he doesn't. And Deborah says, listen, fine, I'll go. We'll go together. And God's going to deliver us, but you're not going to get the credit. A woman's going to get the credit. And Barak says, well, all right, so it is. And so they find two tribes. Remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. And so they're each named, these tribes, after the sons. And she finds 10,000 men out of two different tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali. And 10,000 men from those two tribes followed Deborah and Barak and went into battle. And as they went into battle, the king of Canaan went hiding. He went hiding into the house of Sisera, the family of Sisera. And he went and he laid down there and put his feet up and let the battle commence. And sure enough, God went with Israel, as is what God does to a repentant Israel. And he goes and he causes chaos, and the army begins to fall. And Barak is now hiding. And Haber, who was the man whose house that the king of Canaan was hiding in, gave him a room and a pillow and blankets and told, you just have a rest. Just go sleep in the back room. We'll leave you alone, king, and everything will be okay. But his wife, Jael, knew this was the moment to strike. And so she took a tent peg of all things, waited until the king of Canaan was sleeping, walked into the bedroom, and drove a tent peg straight through his temple. How many of you knew this story before? I mean, there's some stories in the Bible. A lowly woman who is not the prophetess of Israel, just the wife of someone who had an available bedroom, kills the unkillable king of Canaan with a tent peg. That is a story. And so sure enough, Deborah's words come true, and the king of Canaan is dead, and Israel, as a result, grows stronger and stronger. And the Canaanites retreat and back off, and Israel has their time of peace. So what's really interesting, I told that story as fast as I possibly could because I want to focus on the next chapter, which I think is really interesting. Having won this battle in the most unique and bizarre and strange ways, Deborah retreats from that and writes a song. Chapter 5, if you look at the top, the little title, chapter 5 is called The Song of Deborah. And among the lyrics in this song, if you wanted to just look there real quick, in chapter 5, is this. Most blessed of women, this is verse 24, most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Haber the Kenite. Most blessed of all tent-dwelling women. Ha, ha, ha. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank. He fell. There he lay. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. Well, how about those lyrics, huh? If you walked into your teenager's room and heard those things blaring over their boombox, you would ask to see what they were listening to, right? And so whenever I see, this is just a goofy thing that I do, whenever I see that a song is being sung in Scripture, I always try to think, I wonder what kind of music that song was to. Remember I played this game a couple weeks ago? This music is what I've got for this one. Gee, kind of a death metal kind of song, huh? I just think the Bible's hysterical. I don't know about you. I mean, it's a beautiful book, but there are just moments that just make me laugh. But that's not even where I want to focus in this. I just wanted to read some of it to you. A little before there, Deborah's a little more serious. And when she's a little more serious, she seems to be thinking back about what happened. In the moment where she needed people to step forward and go with her, to face the giant army of the day, the people who were oppressing them, she said she needed 10,000 people, and 2 tribes responded. And she went to war. She went to war with the willing. The people who are willing to dare greatly. The people who are willing to risk everything and put everything on the line. And she's now looking back at victory and thinking, my goodness, only 10,000 people willing to risk everything. And yet we won. And so the text we're going to read today is Judges chapter 5, verses 13 through 18. And listen to what it is that Deborah is thinking on as she thinks about daring greatly and risking. Think about how she calls some out and she praises others. Think about how she thinks about how risk leads to the victory that God has planned for them. Would you join me in standing as we read Judges chapter 5, verses 13 to 18. Then the men who were left came down to the nobles, the people of the Lord, came to me with the Almighty. Some came from Ephraim, whose roots were in Amalek. Benjamin was with the people who followed you. From Machir, captains came down. From Zebulun, those who bear a commander's staff. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Yes, Issachar was with Barak, rushing after him into the valley. In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Why did you stay among the campfires? To hear the whistling for the flocks? In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, why did he linger by the ships? Asher remained on the coast and stayed in his coves. The people of Zebulun risked their very lives. So did Naphtali in the heights of the field. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. You hear the tone here. She starts going through the people that she's leading, thinking through the people that God has given to her, and she's looking back and noticing that some tribes, when the rubber met the road, when it was time to move forward, when the call was clear on them that now was the time to release themselves from oppression and face their oppressors and have God, the one who promises victory, give them and deliver them victory, she begins to notice that some people under her command hid behind the protection of the Jordan River. Others found coves and caves to put themselves in. When the rubber met the road, there were people who hid. But the victory was brought by the ones who risked their very lives. Dan, those people, they were in their ships because they were looking for an escape plan. When it got difficult, when it got tough, they were ready to retreat. Their plan was to retreat when it got difficult. But she looks on these 2 tribes, and she thinks about the victory, and she recognizes that Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, let's be honest. They're not famous tribes. They're not big, bad tribes. They don't carry on in the stories through the New Testament. These are common, everyday, normal people. We're told that they risked their very lives for the mission that God had given them. For them, God's promise that God would be present with them, God would be their help, God would deliver them and carry them was enough that they would put even their lives on the line for the call that God was placing on their lives. They risked their very lives. This, I believe, is a good template for us to think about moving forward together in a year like 2019. I have a deep sense within me that when God calls us forward or into something new, God is not calling us to risk our lives without God getting in the mix with us. When God calls us to something, God isn't testing us to see if we're willing to do it, but God goes before us and with us and gets in the middle of the skirmish with us. When God calls us to great things, God does not leave us on our own to see whether or not we are worthy. God calls us alongside of him into futures that he could partner with us and help us wherever he leads. I read a line this week from a clergy coaching site that just really struck with me, especially as we're living in this time of past and future, and where are we going, and what are we going to look like, and what is my role? It said this: if a church loves a past era more than its current mission, it loves the wrong thing. If a church loves a past era more than a current mission, it loves the wrong thing. Imagine for a moment if we put this on this text. What would happen if Zebulun and Naphtali, instead of risking everything for where God was calling them, instead said, that's not how Ehud would have done it. Ehud wouldn't have gone and confronted the Canaanites. And yet churches do this accidentally over and over and over. They love a past era more than their current mission. I wanted to share with you just a couple things across my time. Like I told you last time we met, maybe you weren't here, I'm currently meeting with a vision team, and we're trying to articulate what are the ministries and passions that are emerging out from within us. What are they going to be? How can we articulate it? This work is happening amongst us. And I wanted to tell you just a couple of stories. We don't need that slide quite yet. I wanted to tell you just a couple of stories of things that have happened in past churches that I've been in that excited me, where people risked their very lives that led to incredible futures. Now, none of these templates would work here because here is Maryland, as there is in the past. But yet, I can be someone who gives witness and testifying to big risks leading to big rewards. When I left seminary and went to Ohio, I pastored in Cincinnati, Ohio, and there we had what was called a back-to-school bash. It was a very small church, about 30-some people, and we started a carnival for local people who were struggling financially, where we raised all of the money to buy backpacks, school supplies for absolute free for everyone. And for a church of 30, we would annually have an event where some 500 children would receive a free backpack filled with every school supply that they needed for the year. And we became known in the community as the Back-to-School Bash Church. And sometimes that's all that you need to build momentum. When you don't become known for, is that church still existing? Do they still meet? But instead, that's the place that gives to students who need school supplies but can't afford them. It changes the trajectory of your church. When I pastored in Florida, I think I've told you this story before, so bear with me if you've heard it before. But we were given a church building in the roughest neighborhood in town. It didn't have any money. It didn't have but 4 people. But it was, and you know, in real estate they say location, 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 right? Well, this was next door to a park that was filled with hypodermic needles that you can go find and clean up at any time. This location was not desirable in terms of real estate or beginning or starting things. But we sensed in our heart that we were called to reach out to transient families who had men in jail, and drug abuse had reached the adults, and there were children. And since that church was planted and founded, there have been dozens of baptisms, multiple families' lives changed, visits to the jail where there would be one person who was in jail to be visited, and connections would be made with 3 or 4 other families, and new visits would be created. And the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ was told to the imprisoned. And the story of the redemption of Jesus Christ was told to families who were hit by addiction, either in their children or in their own lives. And lives have been transformed out of that. In my last church, we started a 501c3 when I was there, which is just fancy tax language for saying a nonprofit, a nonprofit ministry. We called it Life Essentials. And when we started thinking about how we were going to do this and praying that God would give us resources, the city of South Portland, where I pastored, gave us a building, like for 0 cents. They just said, well, we can't figure out how to help people there, so maybe you can. And they gave us a building. And we began to meet in this building and started clothes drives, and just twice a month we gave away free clothes to anyone who would come. We did food poundings. We did life teaching. We did all sorts of life coaching. We started Bible studies for people. We worked with the senior adults, and we worked with the kids and the young. And we started out of just a sense that God was calling us to do something new. And the city and the people around us, people who had nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever, one by one began giving us things as big as buildings to start our ministry. I don't know what's next here. I don't know that yet. I'm in prayer, and I hope you're in prayer with me. I hope you're joining with me, praying that God would make clear what we're going to start here. But I can tell you as a testimony from my life that being present when God opens doors and saying, I'm willing to risk my very life to follow what God is giving us the opportunity to do, makes the largest difference. I'm not so sure that God needs your skills as much as he needs your willingness. You see, I think God's pretty big. I think God can handle big problems. I think that God can give resources. I think that God can gift us with words to speak. I think that God can gift us with opportunities. God is pretty amazing. Really, what he's looking for is a few people who will say, I'll risk everything to follow him. I'll put the outcomes on God. I'm going to trust that if he calls me to something, he's going to help me. And just show up. Be the man or woman in the Teddy Roosevelt thing that we said before. The person not who's criticizing or calling plays like an offensive coordinator from a box, but be the person who gets in the arena and says, I am going to do the work of the Lord, no matter how crazy or how hard or how scary or how strange it possibly sounds. I have a slide. When we're thinking about vision, I keep thinking about this, and I'm interested in continuing to hear stories and talk to people here. But a church's vision, I think, is a combination of these things. What are the community's needs? People who don't need Jesus, what is it that they need? What is it that they're looking for? Then you look at church, passions and skills. What is it? What kind of people do we have? What are the things that we're passionate about? What are the things that we sense God is calling us to? And then resources. What are the things that God has already given us and put in place that we're able to leverage? And when you look at the middle space of that Venn diagram, that's where vision begins to emerge, where you can identify community's needs, our resources, and our passion and skills. And where all of those things begin to overlap is a great place for a church to say, these are the kind of things that we should be doing, and these are the kind of people we should be. And again, I'm interested in continuing to hear from you all as you sense what God is calling you to do. I said last week, and I kind of want to re-emphasize it, at a certain point, your pastors can't be involved in doing everything, right? Now, we try to stay very involved. We try to stay very busy. We try to be present with you as much as we can. But we really need the people of God to stand up and say, I'm going to start something. I'm going to take ownership of something. I'm going to lead something. I'm going to gather a group of people. And we're going to start this with the help of God. Why? Because God is asking me to. And that's all I need in order to risk greatly, to put my life on the line. All I need is a sense that God is stirring in my heart. And so we've got two, you may be wondering what's going on here. We've got fire over here and a grave over here. And when the band comes out to play, I'm going to invite you to prayerfully think through two questions and give you the opportunity to stand and respond to those questions. The first is on this left side, your right side here over by the fire. You'll see that alongside of the black wall here, there is a table with papers. And what I want you to do over there, if you're willing to do, is to really address what it is that is a fear that's working within you. Maybe God has called you to something in the past or is currently wrestling with you or speaking to you. But we do a really, really good job of humans of laying out all of the reasons we can't do something. We negotiate with God our fears and our reasons that we're not available. And so we've chosen fire here because a fire is representative of the Spirit, right? The Spirit comes in fire in the text very often. And so I want you to go to that table over there. It'd be really helpful if you went to the back and come forward so that we didn't bottleneck. And address between you and God what it is that you're afraid of. What is it that's holding you back? What are the fears that cause you to be paralyzed and not respond to what God is calling you to do in your life? And then upon writing down what it is that you're afraid of, bring it and drop it in the fire and watch the representation of the Spirit just consume our fears. And let it be a representation to you that God receives our fears. He takes our fears seriously, but that when we give it over to the work of the Spirit will consume your fears and will show you a way through. So your fear might be evangelism. I don't want to talk to people at work about who Jesus is. I don't want to invite my neighbor to church. That's weird. They'll think I'm strange. Your fear may be community, getting to know people, going to a small group and having to tell your story and have other people hear who you are. Your fear may be starting something big that you sense God is calling you to. Your fear may be talking to a parent or a child about something difficult. Who knows what it could be? But the good thing about fire and burning is that it'll become anonymous within just a second. You can be honest before God over there and place it on the fire, and no one will ever know what it is you've written. So I want you to think about fear over there. What is it that you're afraid of that's causing you to be more like a Dan waiting in a boat to escape? Over here, we've put up a grave, and similarly a table with pens and papers as well. This is to be representative of the burial and resurrection of Jesus himself. And so over here, I want you to name a sense of what God is calling you to do. Not so much a fear, but something that is working within you, something that you're thinking about, something that you're wrestling with, a person you're praying for that may feel too far gone, a ministry that you think you may want to join or start, a movement of God that you're hoping to see come across our community or our church. And I want you to write that down there on there and put it in the grave. Why the grave, you may ask? Why would we put the grave of Jesus there? Well, because dead things go into Jesus' grave and alive things come out. And so whatever it is that you're wrestling with, the thing that seems too big to do, I want to symbolically place that right in the place that Jesus went in as a reminder that God can bring life to things that we sense are dead. And so the band is up here. We're going to sing our final song. You don't have to sing. You can stand and move. You can go and write. You can participate in both sides, a fear and a hope of what God can do. But as we move forward together, we're going to need the help of God. We're going to need to lay fears aside. We're going to need to dream big dreams. And as we become honest about these things, and as we put them in the hands of God, we will find that God delivers and acts on our behalf. But we must follow him. So let's take this moment. As the band begins, I invite you to stand and then move about the sanctuary and prayerfully respond to what God is speaking to you.